Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Diane Keel, and I'm the chair of the Maine Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and this briefing shall come to order. For the benefit of those in the audience, I will allow my colleagues to introduce themselves by saying their names and where they reside. Starting.
Morris Gilbert, Auburn, Maine.
Rachel Talbot Ross, Portland, Maine.
Diane Keel, Orono, Maine.
Carl Tony, Scarborough, Maine.
Paul Robinson, Lewiston.
Phil Netto, Lewiston.
Also present are U.S. Commission on Civil Rights staff Barbara DeLaVez and Evelyn Boer. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is an independent bipartisan agency of the federal government charged with studying discrimination or denial of equal protection of the laws because of race, color, religion, sex, age, disability, or national origin, or in the administration of justice. In each of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, an advisory committee to the Commission has been established, and they are made up of bipartisan persons who serve without compensation to advise the Commission on relevant information concerning their respective state. At today's meeting, it is our purpose to hear testimony to examine voting rights in Maine, including potential barriers to voting in the state of Maine. Our efforts today could not be more timely. Yesterday, the Senate Intelligence Committee released its draft recommendations to address the Russian interference in our 2016 election, including a recommendation that states take steps to secure the vote by rapidly replacing outdated and vulnerable voting machines. The testimony we hear today and what the committee learns will be shared with the Commission. We also hope to submit in an advisory memorandum in support of the Commission's 2018 Statutory Enforcement Report examining voting rights enforcement. Today, we are fortunate and thankful to have a full schedule of panels who will share with us their expertise at this briefing. I would also like to present the ground rules for today's meeting. This is a public meeting open to the media and the general public. We have a full schedule of people who will be providing testimony within the time limited available. After all panelists have concluded their statements, committee members will engage them in questions and answers. To accommodate persons who are not on the agenda but wish to make statements, we have scheduled an open forum at the end of the briefing. If you wish to speak, please add your name to the list at the registration table where you came in. Please note that the open comment period is not an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists, but rather an opportunity to express your concerns and opinions regarding voting rights in the state. In addition, written statements may be submitted by mail to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Please see staff for more information. Though some of the statements made today may be controversial, we want to ensure that all invited guests do not defame or degrade any person or any organization. As the chair, I reserve the privilege to cut any statements short that defame, degrade, or do not pertain to the issue at hand. In order to ensure that all aspects of the issues are presented, knowledgeable persons with a wide variety of experience and viewpoints have been invited to share information with us. Any person or any organization that feels defamed or degraded by statements made in these proceedings may provide a public response during the open comment period. Alternately, such persons or organizations can file written statements for inclusion in the proceedings. I urge all persons making presentations to be judicious in their statements. The Maine Advisory Committee appreciates the willingness of all participants to share their views and experiences with this committee. I would now like to begin our briefing by introducing the Secretary of the State of Maine, Matt Dunlap. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and distinguished members of the Maine Advisory Council on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. My name is Matt Dunlap. I am a neighbor of the chair. I live over in Old Town, not too far from Orono. And I think the towns of Orono and Old Town do deserve some congratulations for their recent state combined hockey championship. I have provided you with some written material. I have a habit of not reading to you material that you have before you. I trust your ability to discern what I've presented to you. I will touch on some of these points in a few oral comments and then leave the rest to you to ask any questions that you may have. I know that you've allotted me a generous amount of time. I don't anticipate on having to use it all unless there are probing questions that require developed answers. So I am the Secretary of State. Maine is one of those states where the Secretary of State is elected by the Legislature. The other states that do that include New Hampshire and Tennessee. Not every state has a Secretary of State. The states of Utah and Alaska have lieutenant governors who fulfill many of the same functions. And all of us do something a little bit different. I'm one of the unique Secretaries of State that has charge of motor vehicles among my many other varied tasks that I execute every day. But most of us do business services, and many of us oversee our state's elections. The Secretary of State in Maine has overseen elections since about the 1890s, when the laws were changed requiring the pre-printing of ballots, which we call the Australian ballot, and supervising the tabulation of the vote, providing election materials to the several municipalities of the state, providing training to their election workers, and then certifying the tabulation of those votes, and then laying them before the respective bodies, whether that be the Legislature or the Congress, when we conduct their elections. So we supervise all elections for county, state, and federal elections. The model that we work on is really quite elegant, and it's unique in the world as how we provide access to citizens for a democratic form of self-governance. And it's something that what we usually have these types of discussions over is access. Who has the process of democratic self-governance available to them. And Maine's legislature has been very energetic for the last 50 years and beyond that, actually, in modernizing and streamlining our elections processes and making them available to the public in a transparent and secure way. Beginning, one of the signal achievements of the legislature was to enact the law in 1973 that allowed for Election Day registration, where people can register to vote up to and including Election Day. Going back to when I was in the legislature, and we removed the requirement that people file sworn affidavits in order to obtain absentee ballots, and innumerable other small changes. At the federal level, the biggest change that we've seen in the last 200 years was probably the passage of the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which provided resources for states to develop the central voter registration system and accessible voting for people with disabilities. It's hard for people to imagine now what the world was like before we had the Help America Vote Act. But as an election administrator and a former election volunteer, and I'd help people, with manage their campaigns, we had 503 different voter files. Some of them were quite sophisticated. Some were written down in longhand, and there were those odd clerks here and there that just knew everybody in town. The development of the central voter registration system has created a really amazing tool for election administrators, and it's a living document. There's no longer the discussion of purging the voter file of those who have deceased. It's something that is triangulated with the registrars of voters in the several towns. We work with it along with the staff from Social Security and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. All the information that is entered in is something that doesn't happen necessarily in real time, but the voter file is updated on a daily basis. So that was a huge improvement. Some of the work that I've been involved in the last year or so, which has been very, very high profile along the lines of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity, and now the recent certification of the People's Veto Initiative on the ranked choice voting statute that was passed in October, has kept us pretty busy and in the news, and I suspect you may have some questions about that. But basically the work that we do is really predicated on the idea that people have a right to vote. And we tend to work backwards from that. I know there was something of a public kerfuffle, for want of a better word, over correspondence that came to residents of Lewiston about registering to vote and what that meant in terms of their other obligations. And under the hat that I wear as a chief motor vehicle officer, when we were debating reforms to licensing that were being contemplated after the 9/11 attacks, which included having a residency requirement in order to obtain a Maine driver's license. And that seems natural that you would only issue driver's licenses to residents of your state, but for many decades, that was not a deciding factor. You didn't have to be a resident to get a Maine driver's license. In fact, for people who lived on the border of our state, who did a lot of business in the state, it made great sense for them to have a Maine driver's license. Most pointedly, there was a circumstance of a law enforcement officer for one of our border towns in the eastern side of the state who wound up losing his position because he had to have a Maine driver's license, but he lived in New Brunswick, and there was nothing that we could do for him. But in the context of that, we did something of a study of residency requirements across the many chapters of our public laws. And policy committees often confront the issues that they are combing through in isolation from other chapters of law. So you get a real kaleidoscopic series of definitions of an immediate family member, what it means to be a resident, what it means to be established as residency. But the guidance that we have from the legislature and from our several courts, both the U.S. Supreme Court and the state Supreme Court, informs us that an American citizen who is 18 years old has the right to vote. Everything else then becomes a neutral factor. So we don't contemplate their right to vote against whether or not they pay taxes, whether or not they own vehicles, have driver's licenses, that sort of thing. We tend to work backwards to make sure that people have the right to vote. So our processes in Maine work quite well. Taking the example of Election Day registration, for a moment, someone walks into the polling place at 8:05 on Tuesday of the election, and they want to participate. They're not registered. They don't have a photo ID with them. They don't have a utility bill. They get to participate in the process. And this is how it works. We don't have, you hear an awful lot around the country about provisional ballots. We don't have provisional ballots. People cast their ballots. Provisional ballots are not cast until the person who has marked it can prove that they are qualified. We do it the inverse way. So someone walks in that situation, and they're given a ballot. It is marked with a secret number. They mark their ballot, they cast their ballot as every other voter. Now, the registrar of voters, in their due diligence and post-election cleanup, will come across these incomplete registrations, and they will seek out the people who have participated and get them to finish their work. Give us a document that shows that you are a resident of this precinct and that you are a qualified voter, that you use a photo ID or some other identity document, a birth certificate or something like that. If there's no problem with the election, everything moves forward into the next cycle, and now they are a qualified voter. Where it comes into play is if there's a recount, if there's a challenge to the election. And like I say, we supervise recounts for federal, state, and county elections. And the way the recount works is that the two candidates, the apparent loser, can ask for a recount. Both sides can have counting teams. So you have individuals who will count for you. And the teams are set up side by side, candidate A and candidate B, supervised by one of our staff. We have a public process whereby we open the ballot boxes. We break the ballots into lots, usually like lots of 25, for example. And then they'll take the lots, the team, and they'll sort the ballots marked for candidate A and candidate B. They count their piles, and then they trade, and they count each other's piles. And when they agree to a number, they move on to the next lot. It moves pretty quickly. Now, they find a ballot with a secret number on it. Everything stops. They segregate the ballot. They contact the registrar of voters from that precinct, and they say, go find that registrant and make sure they're qualified. And they will do that. They'll go find them at work, call them at home, make sure they complete their registration, that they are a qualified voter. If they can find them and they're a qualified voter, the secret number is removed, the ballot is shuffled back into the pile, and then the count is completed. At no point in that process is a voter shorn of their right to vote. And so it works very, very well. And the legislature deserves a great deal of credit for building this system the way they have. In the public discourse right now is a lot of discussion about cybersecurity, and the chair did mention the remarkable document that came out of the Senate Intelligence Committee yesterday, which I was transmitted a copy of and asked to review. And unique in my experience as Secretary of State in our commerce with the federal government, I found nothing to complain about in this document. In fact, it reads very much as a coda to the work that we have done in our work in elections administration, and some of the points that they make are voter verifiable paper trails as opposed to electronic voting machines. That was an affirmative decision that we made when implementing the Help America Vote Act. The one aspect that we were looking at technology for was accessible voting. And when I first was elected Secretary of State, this was when the money had just been allocated and the states were going to have money to work with. And going to these demos was like going to a science fair. It seemed like everybody had picked up a contract with some small elections company and they wanted to provide election services to a bunch of states for their share of that $20 billion. So we did a couple of things knowing that technology is fragile and it outdates rather quickly. We got help. We asked the Disability Rights Council for some help on accessible voting, and we looked for what we thought was reasonable technology. And one of those, this is technology that's now dated and been replaced, but what we used for many years was a system that employed a telephone and a fax machine. Because people with disabilities often have adaptive phones and they know how to use them. So we had audio ballots that a person with disabilities, whatever that disability was, and we counseled our elections officials, sometimes disabilities are not visible, and no one has to have a disability in order to use that solution. Anybody can use it if they wish to. But for these people, maybe they could perhaps be illiterate and couldn't read the ballot, so having somebody read it to them without assistance, without somebody marking their ballot voting for them or knowing how they were voting, we thought was quite critical. And so the fax machine, it was all linked to a central server. The ballots were sorted by district and precinct. So someone going into a polling station would use the audio ballot device. They would mark their ballot by their phone device, even had a sip and puff that would work with it, and they would have their ballot faxed to them. They would then turn in their paper ballot to the elections official. We use a different system now that it works in the net effect in a similar way. They get a paper ballot. So we've always stayed with the paper ballot primarily because of the critical nature of our recounts, which is probably the most important service we provide to state government, is an accurate recount. And that has kept us out of trouble with technology. In terms of the work that's been done by Congress at looking at cybersecurity, this is something else that we have been very, very dialed in on to make sure that our cyber systems are secure. Our security plans, you should know, are predicated on the notion of not if they get breached, but when they get breached, and then developing plans to deal with that when it happens. The folks that I work with, I believe, are some of the best in the country, including my Deputy for Information Services, Donna Grant, who did something in the federal government that was top secret. We're not exactly sure what it was. I think it rhymes with thermonuclear, but I'm not sure. But she has completely turned around all of our computer systems and made them quite modern tools that serve many agencies beyond ours. So one of the things I do point out in my written testimony that I will iterate here as well is that as well as we do and as hard as we work, we have to bear in mind that we shouldn't pat ourselves in the back, because I was a commercial cook for 20 years. And there's a saying in the kitchens that you're only as good as your last plate. So you always have to keep thinking about the next project you're working on, and current in the news, of course, is ranked choice voting. And when we certified the people's veto, we had approximately 99 days to implement an entirely new voting system that's never been used on this scale. And frankly, we're quite excited about the whole prospect of it. Our folks are working very, very hard on the rules of engagement. We're looking at different technologies. We've gotten pledges of cooperation from some very key players that we're grateful to have that cooperation, because that will inform what we ask for from the legislature for resources to implement. And we think that it's going to be a big success come June, all else being equal. The other thing I'd like to point out to you is that the partnership that we are now enjoying with the federal government is rather unprecedented. it seemed like our relationship, especially with our intelligence agencies, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, was completely perpendicular. We heard about what they were working on in the news, and that is somewhat dissatisfying to hear about the integrity of our elections being undermined while watching the weather. The efforts that Homeland Security has made over the last 6 to 8 months has been really quite extraordinary. They have reached out to the secretaries of state. We have been going through security clearances. We've been in classified briefings to see what they're looking at, and we have a much, much better understanding of how they're analyzing the information they receive and exactly how the outside actors are trying to impact our public discourse and where they are successful and where they are not. And while the information is classified, I do believe I am free to say that our elections are quite secure in their conduct. So I could go on at length because my staff knows that I'm something of a windbag, and I think that's probably why you allocated me a fair amount of time. So I think rather than go on much longer, I just want to point out that it should be not at all a disadvantage to argue about these things and to disagree about them, and that is how we come up with better ideas and improve things, is that type of give and take in the public discourse. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to entertain any questions of the Advisory Council at this time.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes, if I could. Well, welcome, Secretary. I was very pleased to see your name added to our list. These are important times when it comes to voting and voting rights and the certainty and the accuracy of voting results. So to have you here is a big coup for our panel, and we appreciate your taking the time. So let me cut right to it. You don't know this, perhaps, but I used to be the Assistant City Administrator here in Lewiston. And in the 18 years in that position, I quickly learned there were two areas of voting in working, having had the opportunity to work the polls, also work with, on the administrative side of this process at the municipal level. There were two areas of concern that were always, I think, at the forefront of concern when it comes to voting in this city. And I'm only going to speak for what I know was going on in Lewiston. Certainly won't speak to any other part of the state, but the first was Bates College. Bates College was a subject of great interest to those who were paying attention to voting processes, voting law. From the very first day that I arrived here, I'm also Bates College alumnus. I didn't graduate, but I spent a couple of years there, so I was in a unique position to kind of hear both sides of it. But for the benefit of the people that are listening and for the record, the issue was the tension that lied between those who believed that residency laws are clear enough in the state of Maine that when they produce the necessary documentation that they need to produce to prove that they're residents of the city of Lewiston, it should end there. The other side didn't want it to end there because their belief was you're entitled, it's the one person, one vote rule. And their concern was always, and again, I don't intend to speak for anyone that takes that position, but generally from what we heard, it was always a matter of not questioning the fact that they weren't producing proper documentation to vote in the city of Lewiston. It was whether or not they were then going to wherever it was out of state that they were going to, and then manipulating the system so that they can vote a second time. For instance, filing absentee here and then going to the next state and doing whatever they need to do at the ballot box, because the time would work in the amount of time that you can do with those things. So your response to that would be what for people in Lewiston that continue to believe that somehow Bates College students are working the system?
If we get them to vote once, we're doing a great job. This is something that's been a bit of a hornet's nest in recent years. And I say that not tongue-in-cheek. It really is true. You get a college student to vote at all, you're doing a great job. I was a college student and went through the University of Maine, and didn't, you know, this is one of the things, again, I don't want to use too many cooking analogies, but when I was in catering services, we would remind the staff, look, we do weddings every weekend. It's a routine. Don't let yourself get annoyed with people because they're only going to get married once if they're lucky, right? So they don't know everything that we know. And we see the same thing, certainly in elections, you know, because we are working on elections 365 days a year, minus Christmas and New Year's and a few other holidays and Sundays. So really about 320 days a year. The reality is that when you have chains of custody of ballots, there are strict accountability rules. I can tell you what happens to a ballot from the time it leaves a ballot printing press to when it's sealed in a ballot box. Now, every cycle, we do get questions because people blunder, they forget, they make mistakes. And absentee balloting is a place where that happens most frequently. So what typically happens is, as a clerk, like say the city clerk here in Lewiston, who's one of the finest in the state, I might add, Kathy Monteo does a tremendous job, and her team. We're very lucky in the state of Maine to have such devoted clerks and registrars and volunteers. So they're doing their post-election cleanup, and they've been allocated X number of ballots predicting a certain percentage of turnout based on their population. So we're going to say 1,000 ballots. And they have issued, you know, 500 ballots on election day, 150 people vote absentee, but 137 ballots were turned in, leaving 13 hanging out there. And now, you know, Phil Netto shows up on the voter list. Well, he was issued an absentee ballot, but he showed up at the Armory. What happened? Well, you can resolve that pretty easily by your incoming voter list. Was that absentee ballot ever turned in? And what happened? We don't know what happens, but I think typically what happens is people forgot that they ordered an absentee ballot, or they lose it. It gets stuck in a pile of seed catalogs and they can't find it. Or they mark it and they realize, you know, I always said I wouldn't vote for Matt Dunlap on a dare. What am I doing? I need to do this differently. Or they make up their mind and then change their mind. Either way, they show up at the polls on election day and they vote, and they've only voted once. Now, in the dozen or so years that I've been doing election administration, we had 2 instances that we couldn't quite break down that way. You know, that we had 2 people who had voted absentee in 2 different towns upon moving. And we turned it over to the Attorney General's office, and the Attorney General's office spent weeks and months investigating these. And what they determined was the people were confused. They went to Town B after, you know, they know the election's coming, they want to make sure they're going to get their ballot counted, so they vote absentee ahead of time, and now they move to Town B. And now they're doing what they consider to be their due diligence. You know, they're registering their truck, they're, you know, getting their mailbox set up and everything. And they get handed a pile of documents, including a voter registration card and an absentee ballot application. They fill it all out, and the ballot has different names on it. And they don't know that they're committing potentially a crime. And so, you know, intent comes into this too. Did somebody intend to break the law? And in those 2 cases, it was clear they were older folks. They didn't know what they were doing. And that's where we find a lot of these gaps, is that people get confused. In terms of, you know, the people moving, you know, coming here from out of state, matriculating at Bates College or any other institution for that matter. You know, the law court cases and the laws are structured around the idea that residency is not something that you choose. It's something that you establish. And that your status in the world is, like I say, it's a neutral factor. It doesn't matter if you're a college student. It's where you intend to regularly return to when temporarily absent from. And that seems like a very nebulous thing. But this is what happened to me, and I often frame it this way because real life experiences work better than theory. I grew up in Bar Harbor. I didn't know what my plan was going to be, but I was going to the University of Maine, and I got to the point where I could, you know, I knew what was going on in Orono, so I registered to vote in Orono. My track coach was running for town council and found out I could register to vote in Orono and vote, and I did. And then I decided to go to graduate school. And I moved to Old Town for 1 academic year, but there was an election coming, so I had to re-register, and I registered to vote. And I planned on leaving next year. That was 29 years ago. And my daughter's a junior at the high school, and I've been living there ever since. And conversely, and I've talked to people about this, that are in positions of, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they're newspaper editors, and I say to them, are you planning on leaving tomorrow? Say, well, no. So what if you get the dream job? You're you're an editor at the Bangor Daily News, and you get the city desk in New York City for CNN. Are you going to pass that up? Of course not. It's where you intend to return, not where you're guaranteed to return. And this aspect was discussed by the Supreme Court in Sim versus United States. In a college town in Texas, the registrars of voters would register people to vote if they knew them. If they didn't know them, they had a little questionnaire to fill out, including, what are your intentions in terms of staying here? What are your plans for living in this community? And it was challenged, and the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. That's a violation of the 26th Amendment, which establishes 18 years old as the floor to participate, and anything else beyond that's a restriction that you can't countenance. It's difficult to explain because, like in Lewiston, we had the correspondence that said, well, now that you've established residency here, there's an expectation that you register your car, you pay your excise tax, you update your driver's license, and it has a dampening effect. Because those laws were written to enforce the tax statutes, to enforce the motor vehicle statutes. The net effect, if you don't update your driver's license, is that if you get a violation and you're not living at that address in the license, you're not going to get the suspension notice if you don't pay the fine. When I was living in Old Town, I've been living there for about 5 years, 1994, I got a letter from the Hancock County Superior Court. I was one of the lucky ones that had been selected for jury duty. And I had to call the clerk of courts with hat in hand and say, I don't actually live in Hancock County anymore. And she said, dear, go to motor vehicles and update your driver's license. That's how we get the jury pool. So, the purpose of those statutes are more self-executing than they look. It's not meant to serve as a hurdle for someone if they register to vote that now they have to pay a crushing tax burden. Yeah, we expect you, if you're going to do like I did and stay in Old Town, that you're going to pay your excise tax to the city of Old Town, which I've been doing as far back as I can remember. But people don't do this every day, and they're not looking at those T's to cross and I's to dot. And eventually they do figure it all out if they're going to stay in a community. But, we allow people to register to vote who live under bridges, people who are homeless. They're still citizens. They still have a right to vote. We have people who vote in our elections who've never been in this country. They're American citizens that live abroad. And they have, their parents may have lived in Lewiston. That's their last known address, and they vote. They send an absentee ballot to Lewiston, or in some other town. And they have the right to do that. So that is really only a partial answer to your question, right, because it's sort of based on articles of trust and faith, yes, that people are doing what they say they're doing. We have investigated these allegations before, that someone who is here from another state, did they register, did they vote absentee in their home state and vote here in Lewiston? And the answer has always been no. We have never seen a substantiated, in terms of administration, we call that a yes-yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, you're registered in 2 jurisdictions, and yes, you voted in 2 jurisdictions. In my time, we've never gotten a yes-yes. We've gotten no yeses and no nos and yes-nos, but never a yes-yes. And we have the documentation to support that.
Thank you. I think that was a really complete answer, I think, for a lot of people that, have their suspicions about government one way or the other, but that's why we do these hearings, is to try to get that kind of information, not only out there in the public, but on the record, and something that will be useful for people to refer back to at some point. I'll have a follow-up question later, but I'd like to turn it over to other committee members.
Thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
We certainly appreciate taking your time and everything. Actually, I have a comment and then a question. And I sort of represent that individual that moved from away, which was a new term after I got here. And the first thing I did was I wanted to get a driver's license. I knew to be established that open a bank account, whatever you needed to do, one of the first things that they asked for was proof of either residence or something like that. Okay. And when I went to vote, nobody asked anything. I mean, you just come in. We had registered, my wife and I, and so we showed up on the rolls, and that was great. After I got established here, excuse me, I was working the polls, and I was, excuse me, I was caught up by the number of people that would come in, and before you ask what their last name was and everything, they had their driver's license out, and they were like from Michigan or Texas or something, and that was fairly new to me. So I said, where you're from, did you have to do this? And they said, yes, we have to show the driver's license. And I turned to the person I was working with. I said, can you imagine that? You know, and it's just, okay, that's the way it was. So I was on fairly safe ground by saying, well, you don't have to do that here. It's appreciated, and sometimes when a person's name is all consonants or all vowels or something, you can look at it. And so that was appreciated, and like I say, I treat that as a very, very important document. Probably after a passport, it's my driver's license that I would protect, and certainly there won't be another state, but when it comes time to renew, I certainly do that. So anyway, thank you for that. My question is, going back to the recent issue that is getting a lot of attention, and unfortunately it's Bates. In your experience, do some of the other schools that attract out-of-state students experience the same thing with the same intensity? I'm thinking University of Maine, Colby, Bowdoin, and if they do, we don't seem to hear it here. But obviously this letter was released not so long ago. It probably stirred up more contentious feelings than perhaps it satisfied. My position on it was that the statement was that if you register to vote, or if you get a driver's license, then there's other things that follow along, and you touched on those. So what is your opinion or your experience about other schools experiencing the same sort of unrest, if you will, or scrutiny?
It's sort of periodic. Bates does seem to be a consistent battleground. University of Maine and Farmington also seems to be. There's been, and I think it depends on the people that live in the community and how they respond to students. University of Maine, we see it from time to time. Not every election cycle, but there are times when people wring their hands over the college students voting in the election, and you know, shouldn't they have to vote in their hometown, and shouldn't they have to pay taxes here, and all the that same type of discourse that goes on. And I think there's also some sort of a mythology around college students that they tend to vote as a block along a certain philosophical line. What I think you look at the results of elections, they break down along their normal demographics. You know, you have people who vote Republican, people who vote Democratic, people who vote for Greens and independents. It's oftentimes issue-driven. You know, this is one of the things that I note with some amusement that when we talk about voter turnout, we don't manage municipal elections, and when we do ballot production, we don't produce 100% of the ballots because that would be very expensive, and we know we're never going to have 100% turnout as much as we want to. We do have a plan in case that happens, but every once in a while you have a town that has 90% turnout. And after the election, and you've done the scramble, you've gotten them their spare ballots, you've allowed them to photocopy ballots and keep track of the number so that everybody gets a chance to vote, and then afterwards you say, okay, what happened? Well, sometimes it's a leashed dog ordinance that will get everybody at each other's throats. So, you know, I don't think the issues that are peculiar to the college student voting debate are anything more than periodically parochial. It depends on the community and the people in the community and how they react, you know, to an emerging demographic. Whether that's college students, and I'm speaking of Old Town now, you know, an immigrant population. You know, I grew up in Bar Harbor. It was very cosmopolitan. And it took me a while to figure out, and actually I was running for the legislature when I figured out why we had 3 Catholic churches within a mile of each other. And you know, my wife's grandparents never went to church together unless it was for weddings or funerals. One went to the Irish church and one went to the French church. So, I mean, those things happen almost organically. I wouldn't say that Bates is necessarily a flashpoint. It does seem to be a recurring issue of debate around college students, but I think we do answer the questions. And, you know, in the 2016 cycle, we had flyers that were put on windshields in Lewiston, you know, that were breaking out the same types of information that was described in that correspondence, that if you do this, you're going to have to pay possibly hundreds of dollars of excise taxes on your vehicle. When I was an undergraduate student, we didn't have cars. Things are different now. But at the University of Maine, a lot of the out-of-state students who registered to vote received emails and other correspondence telling them that their financial aid packages would be in jeopardy for that. And this gets to the seamy underbelly of getting out the vote. You know, you're trying to get out your vote, not the other guy's vote. And I think sometimes that leads to election tactics that we find ourselves condemning. You know, something that would intimidate somebody from participating in the process. And when we get these questions, I don't assume that someone's trying to intimidate somebody else. They may be working with information that they cleave closely to, that if you're a citizen, you have to do all these things, and now my philosophy expects you to do them, and I'm going to get that information to you. Like I say, I mean, like residencies, for example, means many different things. Perhaps the most severe standard of residency is to hunt or fish, because there's a monetary benefit to getting a resident versus a non-resident license. And you have to prove that you've been domiciled and residing in the state for a calendar year before you can get a resident fishing license. And if you don't, and I dealt with this as a legislator, a fella called me up, he'd been written up, gotten a ticket for fraudulently obtaining a resident fishing license. He lived in Stillwater, he paid taxes in Stillwater, but his driver's license was a North Carolina driver's license. And he's driving his daughter's car, which was registered in both of their names from North Carolina. And the law for Fish and Wildlife, Title 12, says that there's a sworn statement that you sign that says that if I am obtaining this resident license, I am declaring that if I'm registered to vote, I'm registered in Maine. If I pay taxes, I pay Maine taxes. If I have a driver's license, I have a Maine driver's license. If I register vehicles, they're registered in Maine. And anything that is contrary to that is prima facie a Class D crime, false swearing. And so, you know, he wasn't trying to game the system, but the game warden had no choice but to issue him a summons. I mean, that's a pretty strict residency requirement if you ask me. But for registration to vote, you have to say, yes, I live at 143 Wagon Wheel Lane. And, you know, you have the document that shows your utility bill or your car registration or your fishing license. And if you have a photo ID, great, and you register to vote and you can participate that day. But that's been built that way. We built the residency standards around hunting and fishing so that we could make sure that the non-residents who had already had a requirement to get a license for 15 years before we started issuing resident licenses were actually paying their share of the freight. Totally different policy initiative. So to the point, I don't think any college, the college towns that I've interacted with, and I've interacted with all of them, have the level of debate that Bates has on a consistent has, but it's probably parallel to Farmington and occasionally in Orono. The other college towns don't seem to experience that same level of discourse.
Well, just a further comment, once being established here and everything, I'm quite proud of being here. And it seems like there was undue attention directed to Lewiston and Bates. And I don't know how this plays in other parts of the state, but they look at it like maybe we're doing something wrong. And you don't need to respond to this, but it's just my feeling that somehow I wish we could get over this finger pointing, if you will. I think Bates is going to continue to, you know, draw out-of-state students and things like that, just like all the other schools. And to me, again, my first comment was that it behooves us to be legal, if you will, and abide by the laws.
Well, you know, I will respond briefly to that. I did note in my correspondence to the author of that letter that it did seem like a rather awkward way to welcome new residents of your community, to impose this dark, foreboding cloud of all the things they were going to have to do. But to your earlier statement about people coming here from out of state, from away, and they may be a college kid and they show their Michigan driver's license. This is something that the public doesn't always understand, is that the realm of elections administration as a field is occupied by the states, and every state does it a little differently. And about 33 states, I believe, do have a photo ID requirement. Maine does not. It gets debated every so often. Secretary Summers chartered the Atwood Commission to look at photo ID for voting and other election administration issues. And that commission came up with a pretty strong majority recommendation against photo ID, looking at the chain of custody of our ballots and the security of the administration of our elections, that the additional security that would be profited by having a photo ID requirement would be completely offset by the burden that would then impose on the citizens to provide it. This is one of the things that I noted in the dialogue after Hurricane Katrina, that there was some sort of bureaucratic mythology that everybody who lived in North New Orleans could take their credit card, put $100 worth of gas in their SUV, and then live in a hotel somewhere in Tennessee for 6 weeks. When actually you had a lot of people that didn't have vehicles, they didn't have much income, and they were stuck. And I think along the same lines, when we talk about the type of documentation that's required to obtain a driver's license, that's gotten quite strident with the Real ID Act. You have to provide a certified copy of your birth certificate. You have to prove that you're an American citizen or in the country legally if you're not an American citizen. It's actually easier for the resident aliens to do this than it is for American citizens. One quick vignette, I helped a citizen renew their driver's license. The fellow was born in Vietnam. He was adopted by an American serviceman. Where he was born, I assume it was a hospital, was destroyed by a missile several weeks after he was born, so there are no records. We went so far as to accept as proof of citizenship his adoptive father's obituary, which listed him as a survivor. Sometimes there are no documents. And this is what I would talk, when I wasn't getting along quite so well with Homeland Security. I would tell them, you can write whatever rule you want. Our work is going to be in the exceptions process, because you're going to have the guy that was born on a farm in Aroostook County. He's worked on that farm his whole life. He doesn't have a social security number. He doesn't have a driver's license. And now he's got to go to Idaho for a family funeral. So they hate it that we accept baptismal records as proof of citizenship. Sometimes the church records are the best records of all. So, the sheer complexity of producing identity documents on the part of the citizen can take sometimes weeks or months to sort out. And it's not something that you're going to sort out on Election Day. And that's what the commission found. They found that it just was going to put too much of a burden on American citizens to participate.
Thank you. Grandma's Bible helps sometimes, too.
It sure does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you very much for your presentation. I only have one question. The presentation that you provided us was very reassuring in many ways. So I'm left with the question of, as you scan the landscape these days, what are the things that continue to concern you, if there are things significant in those arenas? Well,
there's no end of concerns if you don't ignore it. And I think that's the danger, is ignoring it. I had a friend of mine who worked, he was a retired math teacher, and he worked as a prison guard at one of our correctional facilities part-time in retirement. And the funny part of that is he saw a lot of his former students coming in, and I can't imagine what that would be like. I mean, that would be my personal version of hell, is to be sentenced to jail in the first place, but to have my 6th grade math teacher be one of my prison guards. But he observed that one of the most fascinating things about that facility was how cigarettes, in particular, could move all over that jail and never touch a human hand, because those guys had nothing else to do all day long but figure it out. And that's what we face especially with this issue around cybersecurity. Some of the bad actors out there, now we know that our systems are actually pretty secure. But it's not perfect. You know, nothing's perfect. And when we were talking about the charges leveled by the FBI and Homeland Security prior to the 2016 general election, that there were outside influences that could undermine the legitimacy of the election, you know, we got our folks together and said, you know, what are our risks? What do we need to focus on? Now, we use paper ballots and we use felt pens. We have election day registration, and that's a paper process. People register by paper. We scan things into the system. We do have an electronic database, which is accessible on a password-protected basis by town clerks, but it does face the internet. And anything that faces the internet is an exposed flank. So we thought if somebody were to try to disrupt our elections, probably the easiest way to do it would be a distributed denial of service attack on our voter file that nobody could access it, lock it up. So, you know, we've done a lot of work in doubling down on our protections and firewalls, but we thought, okay, in the run-up to the election, we'll tell the clerks just to do a copy of their town's voter file on a memory stick every day. So if it does get blocked out, none of the information they have is more than a day old. So, you know, that was a short-term solution to what could have been a potential attack. The attack never materialized, partly because, you know, our systems are firewalled. And we, you know, on our state web portal, we have had DDoS attacks in the past. The solution has been to get a bigger pipe so the DDoS doesn't have the same effect if you have a smaller pipe for interfacing with the system. But along that line, I think that, you know, when we are asked questions about, you know, what we have that faces the internet and how secure it is, you know, we think about these things too. So the programming for our tabulating machines, they're programmed to read that precinct's individual ballots. That is done by our vendor. They are put on memory sticks. They are mailed. They are not transmitted online. To us, we transmit them by mail to the towns. They test everything to make sure it works properly. You always have the paper ballots if there's a question about the outcome of the election. The area of real vulnerability that we identified where voters would get cut out of the process were those voters we try to service under the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, where we can transmit electronic versions of ballots, have them scan them, print them, mark them, scan them, and then transmit them back. We might lose those voters, and that could account for as many as 2,000 or 3,000 voters in the course of an election. Again, that did not happen either. So we are always thinking about those things and making them more secure, and having actually now the resources of the federal government. They have a lot more resources, I've noticed, than I do. And they have some pretty good people that work in their intelligence agencies and some of the major software companies that experience constant attacks to their products. And they've been very good partners for us. I just think we have to keep looking. And you know, it's a constantly shifting chess game. As long as you're going to use technology, and by the way, that is technology. And we should never discount that. And as long as we keep that in mind, and you know, we've been able to do this, I think, rather elegantly without making it more difficult for the voter. And that's a process and policy question. And again, to Mr. Robinson's question about photo IDs, that's a policy decision. You know, the legislature has to make a policy decision on whether or not to do that, and every individual state does. There are states that are vulnerable, and I think that's what the Senate Intelligence Report does speak to, is those that use touchscreen voting machines and those that do not produce paper ballots but have an electronic record. You know, I am not a computer person, but even I find myself gasping in horror at the idea of having only an electronic record to back up your election rather than those instruments that were handled by the individual voters.
Thank you.
Just one quick question. Someone moves from, say, Lewiston to Auburn, was registered in Lewiston on the voting rolls, registers in Auburn, changes address on the driver's license. How long does that person remain on the voting rolls in Lewiston? And what prevents them from, say, voting in both, if their name is still on the voting rolls in both cities?
That's an excellent question. It's not real time. It really depends on how fast the registrar of voters can do their post-election cleanup. Like, say that happens on election day. You know, if it happens outside 5 business days before the election or 10 business days before the election, they should have that information entered into their voter file before they print their incoming voter list. And the incoming voter list is what they check names off of.
Yes.
That's how you reconcile your total ballots cast versus ballots issued and unused ballots. There's a whole cascade of things that the numbers have to come out to 0, you know, that you don't have an extra ballot and you don't have an extra voter. So it can take a few weeks. Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes it never happens. And that really is a matter of local administration. And you hear it. I mean, after the president was sworn into office, the great scandal that many members of his cabinet were registered in 2 different states. Well, that's an administration oversight. You know, somebody in Florida didn't take them off their voter file. Now, on the Maine voter registration card, you have the information about yourself, you know, your address and everything. But there's also a space in there, if previously registered, where were you registered? And it's incumbent on the voter to put that down. You know, so in my case, I was previously registered in Orono, and then I moved to Old Town. So the Old Town city clerk is supposed to call the Orono town clerk and say, take Matt Dunlap off your voter file. If they don't, it'll stay on there. Now, if somebody does in fact vote twice, they don't get away with it. And this is, we sometimes refer to this process as the jungle drums, because clerks actually talk to each other. And they look at their voter file, they look at their incoming voter list, and they look at the CVR, and they say, now, Maurice Gilbert, is that the same Maurice Gilbert that you know? And, you know, if somebody has appeared in 2 incoming voter lists, eventually we're going to catch that, and they're probably going to be prosecuted. It might not happen for weeks or months, and it doesn't really matter if it's had an impact on the election. It's a crime to vote twice in the same election. Thankfully, it's never happened in my tenure. So is it a possibility? Yes, it's a possibility. There's no vertical screen that we can put up that would be so impermeable that it wouldn't also disenfranchise legal voters.
But the procedure is that the city clerk in Auburn would notify.
Yes, it is. Yes, that is the procedure, and if somebody were to vote twice, they'd probably catch it at that time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, and Rachel?
Thank you. Just want to add my thanks to the Secretary for being with us today. I wanted to just ask you about your thoughts on legal non-citizen voting. Mm-hmm. This has come up in the city of Portland in the past, and gets raised almost every single year about the validity of having a legal non-citizen vote. Can you weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think there's some very, very strong arguments for that, because you have, we call them permanent residents, permanent resident aliens. You know, these are people who live in our communities. They have not obtained citizenship. It's blind to us whether or not they're on any path to citizenship. Sometimes they're just here to work for some period of time professionally, but they may be on a path to citizenship. Becoming a citizen is not what it used to be. It used to be you came, and this is the thing about, we deal with a lot with motor vehicle law. The issue around immigration has changed dramatically over the history of our country. And, you know, Maine had several ports of entry for immigration, and we have many of those records in the state archives, people who came here from other countries. And this was one of the hang-ups on the Real ID Act, is that prior to, I think it is about 1940, if you came to America as a minor child under the age of, I think, 13, with your parents, you were automatically made an American citizen. There was no paperwork. You were just an American citizen now. And of course, in the days of Ellis Island, we know about the screening processes. They made sure that people were competent and, you know, not criminals and that sort of thing, whatever judgment tools they used. And then you would take an oath that you were an American citizen, and off you went to start your new life. And now it's an extraordinary process to become an American citizen. It takes years. So the argument against non-citizen voting in municipal elections is that, election law says you have to be a citizen to vote. And in most instances, unless there's a town charter that stipulates to the contrary, towns follow Title 21A, which is state election law. And under state election law, it takes its guidance from the state and federal constitutions on citizenship, where you are either naturalized or you are born on American soil pursuant to the 14th Amendment. And that is also subject, as you know, to some ferocious debate in some corners of our nation. The issue, and that's pretty much a factual vertical argument, that if you're going to follow election law, you have to follow election law. Now, a municipality, if it has a charter, has the ability to amend its charter to allow non-citizens to participate in municipal elections. It was taken up in Portland a few years ago, and it needed permission from the legislature to proceed, and the legislature did not grant that. My own posture on it really is immaterial, but I think that if a community feels that people who live in their community pay taxes and should have a say on how those tax dollars are used, that should be the sovereign right of that community to make that determination. So I don't have an issue with it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Secretary. We really appreciate your time and input.
Well, thank you for the hospitality, and good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The second panel, please come up. Mr. Brown, Mr. Hayden, and Ms. Luther.
Thanks. I know, me too. I was thinking. Hi. How are you? Very well. Nice to meet you.
Should I start with Ann?
Barbara, I have copies? Did they already have? Yeah. Great, sure.
Okay. We'll start with panel 2, and with our panelist Ann Luther from the League of Women Voters of Maine. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me and the League of Women Voters to speak before you today. I did bring written testimony because I want to be careful with my words. I'm not going to take the risk that Matt Dunlap took and wing it. I'm going to try to go through this as written, but I'll try to skip over some of the stuff that he already covered, so it doesn't take too much time. For nearly 100 years, the League of Women Voters and other leagues across the country have been working to educate and register voters, eliminate obstacles to voting, and make government at all levels more accessible and responsible to its citizens. The League supports full voter participation by all eligible American citizens, and we oppose efforts to create new barriers that block citizens' constitutional right to vote. Is it good? Thank you. Is that good?
Here, do you want to use mine? I could just slide mine over.
Is the better one?
We could share. It's fancier.
Is that better? Oh, golly, that's a lot better. Holy. I'm not going to start over. Okay, over the last several years, the League of Women Voters of Maine has worked on several pertinent issues that may be of interest to the Commission. We've done work on photo ID, student voting, election integrity, automatic voter registration, incarcerated citizens voting, and same-day registration. In addition, we have supported measures for true early voting and for ranked choice voting. We are in the middle of an examination of primary election systems to ascertain whether civic engagement would be improved by adopting any changes to our closed primary system, where only those enrolled in a party may participate in primary elections. We have not come to a position on that question yet. In any case, I'm not going to cover the entire landscape of our portfolio this afternoon, but I do want to focus on those aspects of the League's portfolio that have the most direct impact on voter participation and engagement. I'll begin with photo ID. Each legislative session since 2011 has seen the introduction of virtually the same boilerplate legislation requiring a strict photo ID to vote in Maine. So far, no photo ID bill has passed. Such a bill was defeated in the first session, just this current legislature, in defiance of which our governor reintroduced virtually the same bill again for the second session. So we're looking at that coming up yet in the month that's left to us. I won't use my time this afternoon to review the reasons why the League opposes requiring a strict photo ID to vote. The short answer is that it suppresses turnout of eligible voters while contributing virtually nothing to election integrity. I have included a synopsis of our public testimony as an addendum to my written statement here. But despite the fact that we have so far avoided enactment of a photo ID law in Maine, we may nevertheless be feeling its effects. The repeated reintroduction of photo ID legislation feeds unwarranted concerns about voter fraud. More important, it creates the impression in some quarters that we do actually have a photo ID law, or that we will have quite soon, or that we should have, thus driving down voter participation. Anecdotally, we hear reports that some town officials are asking for photo ID from registered voters, either misinformed themselves about whether we have such a law or misguided in the application of their considerable authority to act as though we do. In the wake of the 2016 election, research in Wisconsin, which does have a strict photo ID law, indicated that their law kept more than 11% of voters in Milwaukee and Dane counties from voting in presidential elections. Wisconsin is my home state. If you know Wisconsin, you would know that those are the two most racially complex counties in Wisconsin. Remarkably, most of the people who said they did not vote because they lacked ID actually possessed a qualifying form of ID. They could have voted, but they thought they couldn't. Are we creating a similar voter confusion in Maine by talking all the time about photo ID? If so, it might disproportionately affect people in poor and minority populations. I mean, we talked a minute ago, and you spoke extensively with Secretary Dunlap about student voting. Maine has among the most inclusive voting laws in the country, making Maine one of the most truly democratic states in the nation. We should continue to encourage young voters to be involved in the democratic process. When young people vote, they establish a lifelong voting habit that pays off for our democracy with higher voter turnout in the years ahead. This is a matter of civic well-being for our state and our nation, whether these young people remain in Maine or not. And of course, we hope they will. Under current Maine law, students have the right to register in the municipality where they attend school. If they have established residency there, students must meet the same residency requirements as any other potential voter, but may not be asked to meet any additional requirements. Legislation has been repeatedly proposed in Maine that would establish a higher proof of residency standard for students in campus housing. This is a violation of equal protection and their constitutional right to vote. So far, we have not passed any of those laws, but surprisingly, they gather a goodly number of legislative votes each time they come up. Maine should not establish these established rights. Government action and deliberate misinformation may be causing confusion on the part of prospective student voters, leading to voter suppression. This is exactly the wrong direction, and we should be encouraging those students to vote, making special efforts to ensure they face no unreasonable barriers. In 2011, the then Secretary of State, not the current incumbent, sent a letter to over 200 out-of-state students that contained a veiled threat of prosecution under motor vehicle law if the students did not voluntarily revoke their voter registration. We believed
along with the ACLU, that the Secretary of State violated the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution when he issued his letter, and we were pleased that he refrained from further action towards students in question when this was brought to his attention. Now, a few weeks ago, as you discussed earlier, the new mayor of Lewiston sent another letter to everyone who used same-day registration to vote in the recent hotly contested mayoral election. This would have included a disproportionate number of young people and student voters in your college town. We applaud Secretary of State Matt Dunlap for swift action to counter the effect of the letter. Although it contained no veiled threats and no inaccuracies, it nonetheless carried the implicit message to those using same-day registration, mostly students, that they are under heightened scrutiny. There are many other demographic groups, we could consider snowbirds, for example, who could be considered for a similar or parallel type of letter. Why only this group was singled out is a good question. Matt already talked about the leafleting and the misinformation about financial aid that some students receive that confuses them about their rights. I won't go over that again. I want to reiterate just lastly that we believe it is our duty as the custodians of the American democratic experiment to build a culture of civic engagement, starting with young voters, and we believe we should be encouraging them to participate, that it's part of a higher education, a quality higher education, to get them engaged in local, state, and national affairs, and to encourage them to vote. One moment. Election integrity, and Matt's talked a bit about that with Russian hacking on everyone's minds and electronic incursions into voting systems. This is always a concern. The League of Women Voters supports voting systems that are secure, accurate, recountable, accessible, and transparent. Our democracy rests not only on the integrity of our election process, but also on public confidence that citizens have in our elections. The League of Women Voters of Maine does not argue that elections in Maine have been compromised or that the people responsible for the conduct of our elections are dishonest or incompetent. In fact, we believe that we have enjoyed a generations-long record of professional, nonpartisan, voter-friendly administration of elections at both the state and the municipal level. Our town and city clerks are among the most recognized and trusted government officials in our communities. Furthermore, research at MIT Election Data and Science Lab indicates that good election administration makes a difference in voter participation. Voters tend to be more confident when they don't wait a long time to vote, not wait in a long line, when they encounter polling place officials who seem competent and confident, and when they vote in person rather than by mail. We support measures to ensure the continuation of Maine's legacy of good election administration and transparency as a healthy tonic to apathy and cynicism. We hope that the citizens of Maine will continue to have access to sufficient information to be confident in the integrity of our election process. We are pleased that Maine voters cast voter-verified paper ballots, and we support the continuation of that practice. Maine and other states have opportunities to work together to enhance elections consistent with national standards. In response to numerous process concerns identified during and after the 2000 presidential election, the League of Women Voters of the United States established an elections audit task force to conduct a year-long study of election audits. The report of the task force emphasizes the importance of transparency in election procedures and the role that post-election audits can play in identifying errors, whether those errors stem from deliberate manipulation or inadvertent mistakes. We support post-election audits, and particularly in this time of heightened security concerns, we believe a post-election audit with statistical sampling and risk-limiting audit techniques would be a benefit to Maine. We urge the Secretary of State, furthermore, to join 23 other states in subscribing to ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which can help states maintain accurate voter registration polls when voters move between states. This would be a partial remedy to some of the questions that were raised earlier. We support measures to institute a program of post-election audits, as I mentioned, and finally, we support measures to increase transparency in the conduct of our elections, including development and maintenance of a formal complaint process. We believe these measures to be more effective in supporting election integrity than some others that might be proposed under that guise. I think I've probably taken most of my time, so I'm just going to skip to the end here. But I'll be happy to answer questions on any of the other material in my written testimony. As I said at the beginning, what we have in Maine is something that people all across the country would want: deep civic engagement, high voter participation. These are a source of great pride to us in Maine. Our message should be simple. If you are 18 years of age, a citizen of the United States, and a resident in your town, you cannot be denied the right to vote. We welcome and encourage you to exercise that right, full stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Yeah, go ahead, take it back.
Thank you. Hello. I also want to thank the staff and members of the Maine Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights for inviting the Maine Heritage Policy Center to participate in this briefing. My name is Terry Brown. I am the Director of Communications at the Maine Heritage Policy Center, and as you can tell, I also, as envious as I am of Matt's skill, I am not going to try to do what he did. I'm going to read my statement. Maine Heritage Policy Center, often referred to as MHPC, is a nonprofit organization that educates the public, engages legislators, and employs the media to support public policy that improves the lives of Maine citizens. Today, I would like to address two important topics that are affecting voting rights in Maine: voter identification and ranked choice voting. The Maine Heritage Policy Center believes it is essential to balance the rights of voters to have their elections protected from systemic fraud, while also providing access to the polls for citizens who might have trouble obtaining proper identification. The Congressional Research Service estimates that about 60% of U.S. voters live in the 32 states that require a voter at a polling place to produce an ID before casting a ballot. Over the past 2 decades, the number of states requiring voter ID has tripled. Unfortunately, however, Maine is lagging behind the majority of states in this regard and is one of only 18 states in the country that require no ID at all in order to vote. After the 2000 election, the Congressional Research Service states numerous studies and reports assessed the nation's voting process or aspects of it and made policy recommendations. Perhaps the best-known study was issued in August 2001 by the National Commission on Federal Election Reform, often referred to as the Carter-Ford Commission. The study was sponsored by the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and the Century Foundation, and it was co-chaired by former Presidents Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. The report noted that states should work to improve, quote, verification of voter identification at the polling place, unquote, and recommended that they require those who are registering to vote and those who are casting their ballot to provide some form of official identification, such as a photo ID issued by a government agency, like a driver's license. A photo ID is already required in many other transactions, such as check cashing and using airline tickets. These commissioners point out that those who register and vote should expect to identify themselves. If they do not have a photo identification, then they should be issued such cards from the government or have available alternative forms of official ID. They believe this burden is reasonable, that voters will understand it, and that most democratic nations recognize this act as a valid means of protecting the sanctity of the franchise. Many of the report's recommendations were incorporated in the Help America Vote Act, which was enacted in October 2002. Title III of HAVA includes requirements for states on voting systems, voter information, provisional voting, and voter registration. Since 2006, states have been required to maintain a single computerized list of all registered voters that every election official in the state can access. Title III also includes a limited voter identification requirement. An individual who registers to vote by mail and has not previously voted in federal election in the jurisdiction must provide a current valid photo ID or a copy of a current utility bill, bank statement, government check, paycheck, or other government document with the voter's name and address, whether voting in person or by mail. Congressional Research Service analysis also states that after the 2004 election, another study was issued in September 2005 by the Commission on Federal Election Reform. Often referred to as the Carter-Baker Commission, it was organized by the Center for Democracy and Election Management at American University and co-chaired by former President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker. Its report repeated the recommendation of the Carter-Ford Commission for states to adopt an ID requirement for voters. Further, it recommended that states require a photo ID that meets requirements specified in Title II of the Real ID Act of 2005, and that states provide IDs with no charge to voters without them. The Maine Heritage Policy Center supports legislation to further these bipartisan recommendations in the state of Maine. Like both of the commissions, we recognize the need to balance protecting the validity of the vote with assuring access to the vote. This need for balance is why we support Legislative Document 1846, the Governor's Bill, presented in the Maine House of Representatives on February 27, 2018, an act to require the provision of photographic identification by voters. The summary of the bill reads as follows, quote, "This bill requires that a voter provide proof of identity with photographic identification for the purpose of voting. The bill specifies the types of photographic identification that may be used to verify the identity of a voter. It provides that a person who does not present photographic identification may cast a provisional ballot and establishes the process for provisional voting. Under the process, if the person can verify the person's identity to the municipal clerk, deputy clerk, or warden, or an election clerk within 3 business days after the election by presenting acceptable photographic identification, the ballot will be cast as a regular ballot. Through the general election of 2018, a person who does not present acceptable photographic identification but is known to a municipal clerk, registrar, or election official at the voting place may cast a regular ballot upon submission of an affidavit by the municipal clerk, registrar, or election official attesting to the person's identity. The bill requires the Secretary of State to provide, without a fee, non-driver identification cards to eligible persons who do not have another form of acceptable photographic identification to verify identity for the purpose of voting." End quote. This legislation secures the rights of voters not to have their votes fraudulently voided while providing opportunities for free, valid identification for those who need it and cannot afford another form of ID. MHPC supports the extensive allowances made to ensure all citizens have access to exercise their fundamental civil right to vote, while also protecting against fraud by requiring identification. Ranked choice voting. The Maine Heritage Policy Center strongly supports the decision of the Maine Legislature to delay the implementation of ranked choice voting system that passed by referendum in 2016. Among the reasons for delaying the new voting procedures is that the Maine Supreme Judicial Court unanimously determined ranked choice voting to be unconstitutional in an advisory opinion. In order to bring the new law into compliance with the state constitution, the Deputy Secretary of State, Julie Flynn, testified before the Joint Standing Committee on Veterans and Legal Affairs on October 16, 2017, that, quote, the legislature needs to further amend Chapter 9 of Title 21A to remove conflicts between the laws governing non-ranked choice voting versus ranked choice voting, ballot counting, and tabulation, end quote. This included 16 conforming amendments that were needed. The Deputy Secretary of State also raised concerns about rulemaking authority and funding for implementation. Proponents of ranked choice voting have submitted signatures to initiate a people's veto of the legislature's decision to delay the implementation until necessary fixes can be made to bring the legislation into compliance with Maine law. Now we are 83 days away from holding a primary election where it is entirely unclear whether the new voting procedures for casting, counting, and tabulating ballots are even legal, all but guaranteeing that many, if not all, of the election results will be contested in the courts. The Maine Heritage Policy Center recognizes the need for elections to be decided by voters in free and fair elections rather than by courts. We must not jeopardize the sanctity of our voting system for the sake of an experiment with one of our most basic civil rights. We must maintain access to free and fair elections for all of our citizens. Thank you again for inviting the Maine Heritage Policy Center to participate in this briefing.
Thank you. Mr. Hayden?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon. My name is Zachary Hayden. I'm the legal director at the ACLU of Maine, and I have some brief remarks, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. The state of Maine has some of the best and most protective voting laws in the country. Maine residents may register to vote on Election Day. They are not required to show photo ID to vote yet. Maine does not disenfranchise individuals who have been convicted of a crime, either during or after any period of incarceration. At almost all major elections in Maine, lawyers fan out across the state to spend the day at polling places, helping anyone who's having trouble registering or voting, responding to challenges, notarizing affidavits for registration, regardless of that person's party affiliation or political philosophy. I mention these features not for the purposes of patting ourselves on the back, but rather to note that even in a state such as Maine, with statutory and regulatory and community commitment to the broadest possible participation in elections, there are still remarkable and yet predictable attempts to prevent eligible voters from exercising their most basic democratic rights. Sometimes these efforts take the forms of attempts to change the law in order to make it harder for people to vote. And sometimes it takes the form of high-ranking government officials or individuals with prestige in their communities using that prestige or their office to attempt to intimidate voters. Each of these efforts is a reminder of the need to remain vigilant. In a democracy, the voters choose the government. And yet time and time again, even here in Maine, we've seen efforts where the government officials try to choose the voters. I'll talk briefly first about statutory changes. Those have been covered already. But in the past recent years, we've seen statutory changes that my friend Mr. Brown discussed just a moment ago to require voter ID. Those have been rejected time and time again by the legislature. As Secretary Dunlap noted, there was an independent commission that was established by his predecessor, Secretary of State Summers, which examined the need for voter ID in Maine, and it recommended against Maine adopting a voter ID requirement. And yet, we have seen in, I think, each legislative session of the current governor's term in office, a new proposal for Maine to have voter ID. It's only been through the determined work of activists and advocates across the state to convince the legislature not to adopt a voter ID requirement for Maine. Those activists and advocates were not as successful in 2011 in convincing the legislature to preserve Election Day registration, which is one of the most protective and best features of Maine's election law. Instead, it was up to the people of Maine to vote to restore Election Day registration, which they did at the ballot in overwhelming numbers. Without minimizing in any way how offensive I find some of these proposals to be to basic principles of democracy, at least they were proposed in a way that allowed for reasoned and informed debate, right? In the democratic process, bills are proposed and they're debated and people present evidence and arguments, and then elected officials get to consider and vote on them. But the same cannot be said of the more pernicious examples of government officials using their prominence to harass and intimidate voters. And my friend Ms. Luther mentioned some of that already, but in 2011, the Secretary of State at the time, Mr. Summers, launched an attack on Maine college students who had registered to vote, sending them what we regarded as threatening correspondence that had the likelihood of attempting to deter them from exercising their voting rights. His investigation into these college students failed to turn up any evidence of voter fraud, and yet he nonetheless sent letters to 191 of these college students warning them that they might be violating Maine motor vehicle laws. And Secretary of State Dunlap talked about a little bit of how those two things get kind of woven together in an unfortunate way sometimes by people who are seeking to undermine full participation in elections. But Secretary Summers did something even more than that in sending those letters to those 191 college students, not only telling them that they might have been violating motor vehicle laws, but he enclosed some additional material in that letter to those college students. Was it additional material about how they could register their car? Was it additional material about how they can upgrade their, re-enroll their driver's licenses or have the new driver's licenses? No. It was additional material about how they could unenroll as Maine voters, an unenrollment form that we believe, after having investigated it, he created solely for the purpose of sending to these students. This was a form that had never existed before. And it was the form called the Voter Request to Cancel Registration. In 2012, the then chair of the Maine Republican Party, Charles Webster, was directly involved in another effort to intimidate and harass voters. In an interview with WCSH Television, Mr. Webster, who was then the chair of the Maine Republican Party, stated the following: "In some parts of rural Maine, there were dozens of black people who came in and voted on Election Day. Everybody has a right to vote, but nobody in these towns knows anyone who's black. How did that happen? I don't know. We're going to find out." Mr. Webster went on to explain that his intended method of finding out about these dozens of black people voting was to send postcards to all newly registered voters in certain rural areas in Maine, with the intent to use any postcards returned as undeliverable as evidence of improper voter registration. In November 2016, on the day before the general election, Governor Paul LePage issued a statement accusing college students in Maine of committing voter fraud by voting in both Maine and other states, though there was no evidence at all to support this accusation. The statement threatened students who voted in Maine with investigation and prosecution for offenses related to motor vehicle registration and ownership, which had nothing to do with eligibility requirements for voting. No other groups were targeted with this accusation, only college students. And then, most recently, in February of this year, Mayor Shane Bouchard of Lewiston sent a letter to newly registered voters, also threatening voters with prosecution for not registering their cars or obtaining Maine driver's licenses. There is no dispute that all drivers in Maine must comply with the motor vehicle laws. But there is nothing in those laws that bear upon someone's eligibility to vote in Maine. And the only purpose in linking the two is to intimidate voters into thinking that they are going to be the object of heightened law enforcement interest if they exercise their fundamental right to vote, a most pernicious form of harassment. I hope that these examples serve as a reminder that even in a state with a strong commitment to open and fair elections, there is still a danger of people using their official power or prominence to push certain individuals and groups to the margins. Also, they are a reminder of the need for vigilance from civil society organizations as well as those charged with enforcing our voting laws. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions from the committee? Rachel?
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for your time today and for the really extensive and comprehensive testimonies that you've each given. I just had a quick question to the Maine Heritage Policy Center, Mr. Brown, and that is your support for voter identification. Is it, do you have any proof at all that with our high voter turnout that Maine consistently has, that this will impact that at all, our turnout?
No, I don't have data on that. What I can tell you is, even here today, we've heard of different types of different types of fraud that can take place, and sometimes the intent is not, it's not intended to do wrongdoing, but sometimes it can be with get out the vote and some of the things we've just heard about. So that's why we support this measure, which both of the bipartisan commissions support, which says if you don't have the photo ID, there are all these other avenues that you can use to still be able to vote. So we think it's a good balance of, bringing Maine along with the 32 other states that have some type of requirement for ID, but also not alienating or disenfranchising anybody because they don't have that kind of ID. The legislation specifically states that the Secretary of State would have to give those voters at no cost a proper identification.
I have a lot of questions as follow-up, but I'll allow for Ms. Luther to also
Yes. Oh, here. We're sharing
Thank
this.
you.
I mean, the evidence is that anywhere between 11 and 18% of Maine people would lack an approved ID, and even though the law requires those IDs to be issued free of charge, I think if you look at footnote number 13 in my testimony, and I didn't provide the entire report, but the GAO did a study that compared a couple of states that had instituted photo ID with a couple of states that had not, and even though photo ID was available to all of those people, voter turnout fell by somewhere between 2 and 3%. So I don't think there's any question that it has a vote suppression effect. And the question is, for what? Like the evidence of voter fraud is voter impersonation fraud, somebody showing up at the polls pretending to be somebody else. That's already a felony. Like, you can go to jail for that today. So people don't really do that. And in Maine, that we know of, there has only ever been one prosecution for that. And anecdotally, I believe it was somebody who voted in an absentee ballot in the name of his father. That's what happened. So I mean, this is not a problem that we have in very large number, and we can expect to see an impact on turnout if we institute that measure.
May I just ask one quick follow-up? Thank you very much, Ms. Luther. again, the question is to Mr. Brown. Are you, do you have any evidence of voter fraud in Maine?
No.
Thank you.
But I would add, if it's okay, that we did hear today many instances of the different types of fraud that can occur and that need to be, prevented. And that's why we support the legislation that we do.
But it is not current, you have no current evidence?
Well, I don't have data, but I mean, we just heard today the many different types of fraud that does occur in Maine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Does or could?
Well, I think we heard from the Secretary of State that there were a number of different types of fraud that he was concerned about with the get out the vote example that he mentioned. And I think even with Mr. Hyden's testimony, I don't know if you would categorize some of those instances as fraud, but there's certain problems and challenges to the integrity of the system that we believe that having an ID that doesn't disenfranchise voters would help prevent.
Thank you.
Sure. And Mr. Brown, you had mentioned that this, by instituting photo ID, there is this caveat that it would be done without any cost to the voter. Who does pick up the cost then? How do we pay for this system?
Sorry. In the legislation, it specifically states that the Secretary of State would be charged with providing those at no cost to the voter who requests it. So my understanding is that it would be something under the elections or the Secretary of State's budget would have to cover that. But again, it doesn't state specifically in that legislation, so I don't know about the funding mechanism.
Other questions, Paul?
No.
Morris?
Excuse me. Mr. Brown,
Yes.
this alternate identification card that the Secretary of State would require, would that be a photographic identification card?
I don't know. I don't know if it would or not. I imagine it would. It would make sense. It doesn't specify in the legislation, but it says, I can read the quote again, if it would be helpful. I summarize, actually, I have the legislation right here. And it summarized, in the summary, it does say, it says, finally, the bill requires the Secretary of State to provide, without fee, non-driver identification cards to eligible persons who do not have another form of acceptable photographic identification to verify identity for the purpose of voting. So it doesn't specifically say that it has a photo on it, but I will imagine it would.
It
I
implies.
don't know. Yes.
I have a question that's a little tangential to the topics that have been discussed so far, and it's for Mr. Hyden. Does the ACLU have a position on the bill before the legislature about the prohibition of collecting signatures, petition signatures, at the polling places?
Oh, I have that legislation right here.
We probably do, but I am the legal director and not the legislative director, and am not in a
That's fine.
not predisposed to tell you at this second what that is. I'm happy to communicate that information to the committee
Okay, sure.
as follow-up. I'd be happy to provide that information.
Okay, thank you. And our other panelists, do you have positions? Ms. Luther?
Oh, you sure? Okay, so Yes, the Maine Heritage Policy Center does have a position. I just coincidentally grabbed this legislation off of my desk today when I was coming here, and I thought I was grabbing testimony that we had provided for ranked choice voting, and when I was sitting back there, I looked and I realized, no, I have an act to increase transparency in the direct initiative process. So I have the legislation here. We do support this legislation because it brings more transparency to the collection process. Oh, okay. Maybe I've got the wrong bill than what you were discussing. This is a brand new, yeah.
Yeah, the bill that you have here is a brand-new bill that would require that notary publics not provide other services to ballot question committees if they are going to serve as notaries, certifying petition signatures, so it's got that aspect to it, and it has a lot of new financial disclosure pieces to it. So, that's one bill. I thought the one that you were asking about was the bill that would ban signature gathering at the polling place.
Yes,
Was
that's
that-
what I was
yeah.
asking about.
Okay.
Does the league have a position on that?
The league did not take a position, but we did provide testimony, and our testimony was essentially that that the effect of that would be to deeply professionalize, ironically, the whole ballot question process, that it would make it virtually impossible for all volunteers, citizen-led, citizen initiative campaigns to get off the ground. It's a long tradition in Maine. I worked on a few of these myself. A couple people get together around the kitchen table. They come up with an initiative. You can run a whole ballot question campaign. I mean, it's a citizen initiative process. But those campaigns gather at least half or more of their signatures on Election Day. The ones that are successful rely on being able to gather signatures on Election Day. And so banning signature gathering at the polls on Election Day would have the perverse effect of meaning that you needed paid signature gatherers in order to put the thing across the line, and it would make it very difficult for all volunteer campaigns to be successful.
Okay.
That was the essence of our testimony.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Brown.
Add something to that. Maine Heritage Policy Center does not have a position on that I am aware of, but I have been involved in some discussions about this type of legislation, and I personally have been a proponent, and I can't speak for the Maine Heritage Policy Center on this specific question, but a proponent of not allowing the signature gathering to happen inside the polling place, because I've been involved and seen conflicts that come up, and it can be seen as intimidating or confusing to voters. So I've heard discussion of, and I'm likely to be inclined to support the idea of making this signature gatherers have a certain distance away from the actual polling place, or maybe be in a separate room or be outside of the actual room. Just thought I would add that.
Okay.
Thank you.
And as Ms. Lucifer was speaking, I was remembering what our position was on the particular bill that you were asking about, and it was only that we took a position on one particular provision in that, which had to do with people engaging in political activity, expanding the zone in which people could not participate in political activity or engage in political activity within polling places or outside of polling places, and we opposed that. And we argued that it was in our testimony that we thought it would infringe upon the First Amendment.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Any other questions for this panel? Thank you very much, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Very helpful. 5-minute break. How are you?
Thanks for the warning.
Where is the?
I had two attachments, and one was.
You know, I We're going to start our third panel with our own committee member, Rachel Talbot Ross. This is an unusual situation because usually our members listen to testimony and do not make presentations. However, because of her unique experience in the provision of the franchise to those incarcerated, we're going to hear from Ms. Talbot Ross. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to say thank you to my colleagues on the committee, and a special thanks to Barbara Delavies with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights for giving me this opportunity today. I'll just make some very brief comments and a little bit of context. So although over the past 15 years, states have begun to reconsider their policies on enfranchisement and the incarcerated, compared to other industrialized countries in the world, the United States is one of the most restrictive in allowing currently or formerly incarcerated individuals to vote. According to the Sentencing Project, in the last national election, more than 6 million people were unable to vote because of incarceration or had felony convictions. When there are about 4 ways in which this impacts those who are incarcerated. There are 4 states right now that do not allow, with a single felony conviction, you are banned from life and would only be able to restore your right to vote with a pardon from the governor. That's Illinois, Kansas, Iowa, and Virginia. There are other states that only allow you to restore the right to vote after your sentence is complete, and further states require an ex-offender to reapply for voting rights. We are fortunate in the state of Maine that we are one of 2 states that has always allowed for the enfranchisement, and so since 1820, our incarcerated individuals have had the right to vote. Over the past 11 years, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, here in the state of Maine, has been working to realize that enfranchisement. We have registered approximately 1,000 incarcerated individuals. We began in 2003 when the NAACP prison branch was rechartered at the Maine State Prison, which is our maximum security facility located in Warren, Maine. In 2003, we were rechartered and began our push to do voter registration drives. It took us 3 years until 2006 to get permission to do a voter registration drive inside that facility. Once we did get permission to do it, though, the response was absolutely overwhelming. For 6 straight years after that, we held drives and then realized two things. One is that while we were holding registration drives, what we weren't doing was educating people about voting. So we decided to partner with the Secretary of State's office and with each of the official political parties, and we provided those incarcerated with an education program that included political party platforms, knowing what was going to be on the ballot, and information on the referendum, giving them information about the Secretary of State's. The Secretary of State issues a fiscal analysis of what referendums would cost if implemented, and we talked about the history of enfranchisement. The other thing that we realized after a couple of years was that while we were focused on the maximum security prison, no one was doing voter registration at the other correctional facilities, including our county jails, where it was just random. If someone knew that they were going to be there while the election was being held, they could ask for they could ask to either apply for an absentee ballot or ask to apply for registration. So we decided that we would work in the other facilities and try to get, particularly the facility in Windham, which is the Windham Maine Correctional Center that included females. We decided that we would go out and try to get as many correctional facilities involved in the voter registration and education process as possible, and we have been able to register inmates at each of our correctional facilities. The challenge for us now in thinking about it is we think we have a pretty good formula for registering and educating currently incarcerated individuals on their right to vote. But our challenge really now is in making sure that those votes are informed. And by that, what I mean is you and I have daily almost an offensive amount of information that comes to us every day, and we are able to investigate and analyze and engage on candidates and issues constantly, 24-hour news cycles. However, folks who are incarcerated do not have access to that kind of information, and we truly believe that for this to be a successful process, that prison facilities, correctional facilities in this state need to allow us to hold town hall meetings and candidate forums, just like you would have access to if you were not incarcerated. By doing that, we believe that we can then start to document what the level of participation in voting looks like by the incarcerated. Right now, there's no data. We don't know what the turnout, if you will, of those who are currently incarcerated look like in the state of Maine. So we have been petitioning the Attorney General over the last 10 years to allow us to hold a town hall meeting and a candidates forum inside these facilities. We've been denied the right to do that since we've started requesting them, and believe that that's the next level of work that needs to be done in this area. If there is one recommendation we could give to the committee, it would be to do that, to make sure that any person who votes in the state of Maine has equal access to information so that they can make informed decisions about their vote. It is particularly important for someone who does not have access to information, who is not part of a public engagement system, to take the necessary steps to make sure that they are. So that is, I would add that we have current plans to do voter registration drives for this primary, since it will be the first time that we will have a ranked choice voting chance to do that. And so we are going to be at the Maine State Prison, the Maine Correctional Facility, and Charleston for the primaries, and then again do another voter registration and information for the general election in November.
Thank you.
Do we ask questions now, or? No. Okay. No, wait.
Mr. Langley?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Advisory Council. I always look forward to talking about voting and disability and access, and I try to be eternally optimistic and think people of goodwill can get together on these things and make things happen, but a part of me is inevitably pessimistic and thinks about the ADA passing in 1990 and the HAVA, Help America Vote Act, passing in 2002, and that was our big federal commitment to getting a handle on election practices and ensuring full access, and how long ago that was at this point. So I'm always torn, but I appreciate your interest in this issue. My name is Richard Langley. I'm the Deputy Director of Disability Rights Maine. Disability Rights Maine, or DRM, is a member of the Federal Protection and Advocacy Network. Each state and territory in the country has a counterpart agency, and we represent people cross disability, cross ages, cross issues, whether in facilities and hospitals or nursing homes or in the community, whether regarding employment or access to needed services or voting, access to voting opportunities. In 2002, when HAVA was passed, a component of that bill created a protection and advocacy for voting accessibility program, and we administer that. And I'm the point person on that, and a number of staffers kind of step up, and it's something people look forward to at election time. It's an opportunity to engage in something particularly positive, and it's very outreach-oriented and educational and hoping to cultivate people's sense of civic engagement and the right to be engaged in these things and not be on the sidelines, which so often people with disabilities seem to live cloistered lives, others making decisions for you, regimented lives, and this is an opportunity to break out of that and engage in things that are important and be part of those decisions. And we're reaching out to some people who are perhaps a person with an intellectual disability, where this is somewhat intimidating, the idea of engaging in this, and they're not sure whether this is a legal process or what does this entail and how much do I need to do. It can be a bit daunting for some folks, so we're trying to bring that discussion into focus and say this is a basic right that you enjoy. I'm not going to read my testimony. I just wanted to highlight a few things here that I think are particularly important for you to know about. There's this concept that's batted around of the missing 3 million votes in the United States, and Lisa Schur is a professor at Rutgers and does a lot of this voting and disability research. And she sifted through numbers and accounted for the fact that some people are kind of perennially disengaged and aren't involved or aren't interested. That applies to everyone. And sifting through that, she determined there, in reality, are about 3 million Americans with disabilities who are not accounted for. It doesn't make sense that they're not at the polls and they're not expressing their choices. And it's a safe assumption, Schur says, and others we see from practical experience, that it's barriers, explains much of that, burdens and barriers to getting to the polling place. And it sends a message. She worries, and I certainly would echo that, she worries, it sends a message to folks that they're not fully welcome in the political sphere. We do see aspects of that in Maine that ring true. And often the barriers are the kinds of things that are readily remedied. They're very kind of common sense things that have not been, and further kind of sends that message like, if my town hasn't made a priority out of fixing that door so that I can get through it with my wheelchair, or other examples, it sends a message, intended or not. I should emphasize, we have a strong, Disability Rights Maine has a strong working relationship with the Secretary of State's office, and they've been great allies and very supportive, and when election day happens, we staff a hotline till the polls close and often reach out to Secretary Dunlap's office and others there to help troubleshoot problems for people, and they've been very responsive to that. Some of these problems, though, and the ones that I think that you should know about, expand kind of beyond things that are readily fixed by my office or by the state of Maine. Physical accessibility, as I said, is a perennial concern. HAVA, when it was originally authorized, had a relatively small amount of money that was meant to be tapped into by communities to address ramps and accessible doorways, and some of those readily fixed but still expensive and on a small town budget concerns. That money has long since been spent, so the principle of HAVA exists and the grand language, but the reality of that as a resource, as a problem-solving resource, that seems not to exist at this point. So when we do election day polling surveys, we dispatch our staff and we try to go to some outlying towns where we haven't been before and do a basic accessibility survey. They're very detailed ADA surveys that account for signage and parking spaces and curb cuts. And when you're looking at a really truly accessible and comprehensive, universally accessible location, you would use that format. We're looking at, can someone get in the door? Can someone get in that door to get to where the polling place is? And in 2016, we randomly selected, I'm sorry, they were not random, but we chose about 115 sites to go to, and they were very much not random. They were places that also were public buildings. So these were the same places where a town meeting would take place. And other civic opportunities were being held, and that also where polling had been occurring for a number of years, so if there was an access concern, which we had already seen there was, it continued to be unaddressed, so it felt kind of doubly problematic. It's a public building, and it's been docked as a place with inaccessible voting situation. So we went back and we determined that 15% of that list of places that we thought would be problematic, in fact, were completely inaccessible. So in those towns, you could not clear the threshold to get into that building. That alone, and that doesn't account for signage and parking and all of these other things. A gravel driveway, which is very unsecure and unstable for a person with a mobility impairment, for instance. Something you or I might not give a second consideration of, to them is significant. That wouldn't have been captured in this. We were simply looking at, can you get through the threshold? Physical accessibility segues into program accessibility. We have had to intervene on behalf of situations where the case I give as an example here, sorry, sure. The case that I give as an example here is involving three folks with significant physical and developmental disabilities who used wheelchairs and were denied an opportunity to vote in their towns. And they had historically voted there, and staffers assisted them to get to the polls, and it was a thing, you know, where they engaged with the election and they watched the news together and went to participate, but they weren't able to communicate in a traditional way. A staffer was there for the town who didn't know them. She thought she couldn't really understand and assumed that they couldn't understand, and made, in essence, a determination about their capacity to vote and turned them away. And we had to intervene. Two of those folks were able to vote that day, and another person was not until the next election. And they were welcomed back to the town. And I think that's, as is often the case, the towns, I think, want to do the right thing. But they have competing pressures. They have standards they have to uphold. They have, you know, rules and requirements. We're asking them to make accommodations and exceptions. And if you're not trained and ready to kind of authoritatively make that decision, I think it leads to a breakdown like what we saw here. Unfortunately, that's a not uncommon problem, this assessment of another's ability to function or understand voting based on the level of their perceived level of their disability. Similarly, we've had to intervene on a number of occasions when a person has appeared and maybe has disclosed that they have a guardian or maybe has not, and there's been an assumption that they do, and a clerk has asked, in essence, does your guardian approve of you voting? And in Maine, we're lucky to have a standard that exceeds that of some other states that says, you know, unless your guardianship order explicitly says you can't vote, you're presumed to retain those rights. And that's important, and we spend a lot of time training individuals and staffers and professionals and people you'd think would be well versed in that, and even in this day and age they're not totally aware of that, so there's a lot of miscommunication. So it's another area where lack of training can lead to a breakdown. As I said earlier, much of what we do is engagement, and we worked with the League of Women Voters, for instance, on creating an American Sign Language video format version of their voter guide. They're kind of the premier voter guide in Maine. And similarly, we've done a spoken language version for people who are people with vision impairments or others who find that to be helpful. All in the spirit of trying to reach out and make information readily available and to encourage participation. And in that spirit of lowering barriers, I would echo the concerns you've heard here earlier today about voter identification proposals as the one that's pending now. As has been said many times, people with disabilities already find voting to be a challenge, and we just simply don't need to create another burden there. It again feels like a solution to a non-existent problem. And I think when you carve away those people you're adding to that 3 million, we will surely see an uptick, and we'll find out if someone who didn't have the money or didn't have transportation, we know how that will play out. So in conclusion, I have listed 6 recommendations, which I think are aspirational, but they're not pie in the sky. We're not asking for a reauthorization of HAVA, although probably the money component of HAVA, although that's probably something that should be considered, right? This is unfinished business on a national level. There continue to be inaccessible locations. For instance, here I've asked for, we've articulated that municipalities should hire poll workers with disabilities and build relationships with existing disability resources to help review the accessibility of their facilities and develop plans for compliance and develop best practices for working with voters with varying disabilities and to increase that comfort level and avoid those interactions around communication and things that lead to problematic situations. Similarly, education for poll workers and others on the basic right of a person to request a reasonable modification and to receive it. Number 3 articulates in a bit more detail, but because this is so fundamental, the idea that a person with a significant disability or without, but a person should be able to choose the assistance that they find beneficial and helpful to them, and rather than others making assumptions about the nature of that support or whether that's appropriate or whether it needs to be someone deemed removed from that, when in fact this is who the person's chosen, said, I find Rachel to be helpful. Rachel knows how I communicate. Rachel knows what I want to do. That number 3, I think, gets at that. It's fundamental to making this real. Number 4, restating the idea that poll workers need to be trained on the idea that it's inappropriate to challenge a voter's capacity based on guardianship or perceived status of disability. And finally, there should be fundamentally, there should be plans to address physical and communication access concerns that ADA and HAVA already address. They have been on the books for 20+ years. And lastly, I would ask that this advisory committee recommend to the commission, if appropriate, if that's how this best works, that voter identification regimes or similar regimes as that be considered unduly burdensome, not promoting of civic involvement, and therefore inappropriate. So thanks so much.
Good, thank you. Do we have questions?
Yes, for Rachel. Going back, Rachel, to your comments about holding informational seminars, if you will, in a correction facility, and you mentioned maximum security. But as you went on and talked about, you had identified, I was going to say targeted, but identified this. Was there pushback from other facilities that didn't want this? I mean...
So thank you for the question. There's 2 different answers. One is we've not gotten any pushback from a correctional facility to hold a voter registration drive. And I must say, even back in 2003, when we first petitioned the facility and the Department of Corrections to hold it, it was not the facility that denied us for 3 years. It was the Attorney General's office in the state of Maine. And I must say that I know that it's really important to the Advisory Council that you are nonpartisan, so I'll say this. And that is that at the time that we were denied, it was with a Democratic governor, Democrat Attorney General, Democrat House, Democrat Senate. So this this is not about a political party. So the Attorney General's office at that time denied us for 3 years to be able to hold a voter registration drive, and I'll just make this other comment about it. And it was not because they were doing it themselves. This was not that there was already a resource for the men who were incarcerated to be able to access voting. No one was doing it, and we were just denied for 3 straight years. But every facility we've ever approached, including our county jails, have welcomed this effort. I think because without the effort, the only way that inmates register or change their address or apply for a absentee ballot is random. They'd have to know they have the right to vote. They'd have to take the initiative to then make sure that they get all the materials. So that's one piece, is that the facilities themselves have not, they've been very cooperative. In terms of the town hall meeting or candidates forum, that also has been welcomed by the facilities. They are encouraging the folks who are incarcerated to be as civically engaged and involved as possible, because they know that that's part of a rehabilitative menu. That as people reintegrate into their communities, that having a voting record is one of those tools that we can point to that helps to reduce recidivism for them to go back, because they're now taking a stake in what happens in their lives and the lives of their neighbors. But, and, you know, the NAACP, although I would say we are committed to restoring the enfranchisement of the incarcerated all over this country, but particularly since we've had it here in Maine for so long, it only makes sense that there is a progression of engagement and involvement. And the pushback to have these candidate forums, or even a town hall meeting in which you Skype, you know, you can Skype the candidates, but it gives folks the opportunity for a back and forth. That has been blocked by also the Attorney General's office, and not the Department of Corrections.
Thank you for clearing that first part up, because I had a note here, and I thought that maybe it was like, don't get me wrong, but you go in and you talk to the warden and say, this is something we'd like to do. And if it was turned off at that level, you didn't have another appeal unless you did go to the Secretary of State or something like that, taking politics out of it.
Right.
It was just a decision that, hey, we don't want a bunch of people coming in, you know, in this sort of thing, because there could have been an ulterior motive. Who knows what else, you know, could transpire. But, yeah, thank you. So,
I would add that that is exactly why we believe that we were denied for 3 years. I mean, I know that the, you know, part of your mission is looking at civil rights, and I believe that the 3 years that we were denied the opportunity to register is because they felt that the NAACP was a partisan organization. They also thought that the NAACP only wanted to register, you know, African Americans and people of color, which is couldn't be further from the truth. We want everyone who has the right to vote to be able to know about that,
right,
and then to be able to exercise it. But I do think that that played into that is the way in which we felt. It may not have been the intent, but the way that we felt the impact of those decisions was because it was our organization asking to do that.
right, and who knows, maybe, you know, without going there, that could have been, you know.
Yep.
Thank you.
Carl?
I have questions for both Rachel and Mr. Langley. Can I
Sure.
answer them? Okay. Rachel, let me start with you, if I may. You've partially addressed one of my questions, but just for a little bit more clarification, I understand about the resistance in terms of going in and being able to do this, the registration, from what you've just said. I'm still not clear about why the opportunity to hold town halls or candidate forums has been denied. Can you amplify that a bit more?
Sure. I believe part of it has to do with the Hatch Act, which looks at any federally funded facility not becoming a place where political activity takes place. But we've had attorneys, civil rights attorneys, we've had constitutional, we've had a number of folks look at this over and over again and believe that this would not be a violation of the Hatch Act, because we would be inviting every political party, every official political party, and every candidate for an office to participate. So it wouldn't be a Democratic gubernatorial forum, it would be a gubernatorial forum. And
why would that not also hold, in terms of denying it, in terms of the voter registration itself? I mean, that is also a political act.
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to it. I do know that part of our argument is that you have streams of funding, federal funding, that go into a number of different state and local actors that hold town hall meetings on controversial issues. And so it does appear to be somewhat of a disparate decision or opinion from the Attorney General's office to only apply to correctional facilities, because we can point to other places where part of a funding stream from the federal government absolutely not only sponsors that engagement, but promotes that type of engagement.
My other question to you was, could you give us any sense of, and going back to the voter registration initiatives that you've held, the progress that has been made in terms of the percentages of people that you have enrolled either over time or relative to the total population of a particular facility? Have you any sense of sharing that kind of data with us?
Well, I wish I had quantitative data to share with you. Unfortunately, there is no means in which to keep it because just without getting too technical, the way that this works is, you know, we started to do the education program because it was clear to us that not everyone knew they had the right to vote, number one. But most of those who were incarcerated actually believed that their residence was the prison facility. And they were not interested in they were not interested in the candidates or the issues that were happening right there in this example in Warren. What we had to make sure that they understood, and this is a piece that produces large number of turnout every single time we do a education program, is that that is not their residence, and this is part of the education to the public. Their residence was their last known Maine address. That is their home address. They are temporarily housed, living in one of these facilities. But when we first started doing them, just anecdotally, we could hold our voter registration drive in one room at the Maine State Prison. It's a multi-purpose room that holds maybe about 100 to 150 folks when we first started doing it. We now have to hold it initially in that room, but we have lines of inmates that go out both sides of the door, down hallways, wrapped around, every single time we've done this, because the room now doesn't hold, we have so much interest that we can't hold the program in one room, that it just wraps around and takes several hours for us to go through. And as I said, in 2016, we had 400 inmates participate in the program. And I think that's from one facility. That, you know, so I think that speaks to the interest level and the need.
Thank you. Mr. Langley, I had two quick questions for you, if I may. In your recommendations, you talked about the need of addressing the issue of training for people at the polling places and the other places where the interfaces occur so that people can become enfranchised and act upon that. So my question is, from your perspective, would it be helpful, useful from a resource perspective to consider reaching out to caregiver organizations or health professional organizations, individuals who have experience with and are comfortable with and knowledgeable about working with people with disabilities as a resource cadre to help work with and train the polling staffers and other individuals? Is that something that?
Sure, potentially, yeah. We wouldn't. I'd be hesitant to over-suggest that the complexity is so great. You know, I think a lot of this is very basic kind of common sense, but I think there's something there. When we've done some coordinated trainings for people, again, with intellectual disabilities, we did some very focused trainings and outreach in 2016. We partnered with the provider organizations that provided services to these individuals, and they kind of knew best how to kind of read the room and to get a sense of what was really going to resonate with people and help us kind of guide our presentation in a way that would really connect that way. So there's definitely, I think, some opportunity there to do that, and some specialized input maybe generally that we could use across the board on communication or other resources or things like that. There are definitely lots of resources in Maine that people don't know about that
Indeed.
we could share.
Okay. My other question is, you talked about the difficulty with the physical barriers and so forth, and the lack of compliance, and so my question is, for those places, I mean, you're engaging often in public buildings for public activities, as in voting and so forth. So, do not those barriers that continue to exist represent noncompliance by the state with ADA?
You know what, they clearly represent noncompliance by those communities. And I have to say, if there's a phenomenon here that you probably can imagine where people seem to be inordinately reluctant to bring up a complaint, let alone litigation against their town hall or the clerk who does their tax. You know, there's just this phenomenon where people don't want to raise that. The connection to the state of Maine, Secretary Dunlap's obligation to them, I think, is unclear. They have to administer those elections that occur. We've had access concerns come up, for instance, during caucuses and primaries, which I think are party-run events, not state-run, but the state uses their machines and they tabulate votes and that kind of thing. So there's an assessment there to be made about where responsibility rests. It clearly rests with the city, right? If we're conducting public business and folks are coming in, then clearly
It does seem to place you and the people you represent between the proverbial rock and a hard place. So.
Yeah. If they called us up and said, I would like to sue my town, would you help us? We would run to go do it. Not that we're in the business of suing, but we need to shift this paradigm away from asking to insisting. And this is not appropriate. But we do have standing. We went to the legislature to get standing to allow us to litigate on our own without a plaintiff, but to take action in cases that were extraordinary. We haven't utilized that yet. It feels a bit like a precious thing that we need to kind of, if we're going to do this, we've got to be able to say this meets those hallmarks of being, you know, compelling public interest and that kind of thing. But we did that. We intentionally sought that standing for that reason, because we've got to force the ball ahead here, and it seems to not be happening otherwise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I just want to mention for the record that we have our committee member, Eric Maynard, on the phone with us now, participating by phone.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions of these panelists?
Carl asked the two questions I had.
Okay.
Thank you.
I know this may be a tiny bit unique, but I did want to just take the opportunity to thank Mr. Langley for his work on voting, because it has led to other advancements for the rights of the disabled, particularly in the city of Portland. And so his work has been extraordinary to date, and I just wanted to say thank you for all of the effort that he makes on this issue.
Thank you very much.
It's extraordinary.
Thank you. I did have a question for Mr. Langley. You had mentioned that the guardianship establishment that's the only place where voting can be restricted. And how common is that? When someone has a guardianship, do they usually not have a restricted voting right, or is it common to have it?
Yeah, I can't say, I've been doing this for years and years and years, and I can't say I've ever seen that spelled out in a guardianship order. And in all honesty, we kind of don't talk about it in a way as if we're giving primers on people on how to set those limits. That's someone else's business if they're going to try to do that. So I've never seen it. It would be unusual. And it makes sense that it would be carved out in the way they assess your medical decision-making and your other decision-making in your life. So it feels like put the burden where it ought to be and say, why can't I, become informed about which party I want to join and how I want to get involved and make that decision? What risk does that present to me or to anyone else?
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Any other questions? Eric Maynard, do you have any questions?
Actually, Carl asked a question, Mike, because the one question I had for Rachel was, am I correct in my understanding that the Attorney General's existence was based on the Hatch Act? And I think Rachel has answered that question already.
That is correct.
Okay. Any other questions for these panelists? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Oh, I thought I saw somebody. We are adjourned.
Do we hear a motion?
So can you have them turn this off and we'll just have a quick conversation?
Thank you.
Gardner. Max.
Max, and then spell your last name?
Gardner.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So we are back on the record, and we are starting the public comment section. And we have one person here to testify. Sir, could you please state your name and spell it?
Yes, my name is Max Gardner. That's Maxgardner.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here. I think that this is an incredibly important issue in our country, but it's quite appropriate that we're here in Lewiston because I'm a Bates student in Lewiston, Maine, a new resident of Maine, or a new voter at least of Lewiston and of Maine more broadly. And just a few weeks ago, many of my friends and over 200 Lewiston residents received a letter informing them of various provisions that are unrelated to the voting law in Maine, and yet were connected by the mayor, by Mayor Bouchard here. And he connected, these provisions include income tax, sales tax, and car registration to their voting rights. Now, I know as someone who registered last year for the 2016 election here in Maine, that I have paid income tax on every dollar of income that I've received in the state of Maine, and I pay sales tax every time I purchase any item in Maine. So those, I can check those boxes off right away. And I also know that the Department of Motor Vehicles has no relation to my voting rights as a Maine resident and as a Maine voter. I've spoken with your earlier witness, Secretary Dunlap, at length about this, and he is, was not able to listen to his testimony, but I'm sure that he is very much on the same page on this issue. But regardless, our mayor, Mayor Bouchard, decided to send this letter to many new voters, over 200 new voters in the city of Lewiston, to what appeared to be as a scare tactic, to scare them from exercising their right to vote, to scare them and to scare other people from exercising their right to register to vote. Because he threatened at the end of that letter he threatened that these violations of motor vehicle policy were a violation of the law and would lead to fines and other possible penalties. This is a clear threat to the voting rights of many Maine voters. And I want to emphasize that in the media, this has been portrayed at some level as a Bates issue. This is not an issue that is unique to Bates students. This letter was received by many people in the community that were not only on the campus of Bates, and that demonstrates to me that this was not an attempt simply to suppress student vote, but rather to suppress the vote of those who are most vulnerable, those who just registered to vote, new residents in this city. And I think that that is just truly horrendous. Furthermore, I just want to say that there was an article a couple days ago in our school newspaper that had comments from both the Democrats Club and the Republicans Club, and they were vastly different. The Democrats Club made comments about how these matters are an attack on our voting rights, an attack on our voice in this country, and not a partisan attack. While the Republicans Club did not address the issue and rather accused the Democrats, or rather just accused the narrative of being pushed that this was an attempt to suppress a Democratic vote. I just want to emphasize that this was very clearly just an attempt. This was a non-partisan, non-biased in some sense attempt to just suppress vote blanketly. I know that the narrative is very much that the voting rights, that suppressing the vote will help one party or the other, but in this case, this is a non-partisan matter. This was very much an attempt to just suppress the voting rights of those who are most vulnerable, those new voters in this city. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you again for coming to Lewiston. I appreciate it.
Does anybody have questions for Mr. Gardner? Carl?
Thank you very much for coming and sharing it. We've heard a lot about this issue here in Lewiston throughout the day, and it's nice to have someone here who's representing the actual situation. So the question I have for you, which you may or may not be able to answer, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I was wondering if, given your knowledge of this, and at least some of the people like yourself who may have received the letter, did you have any firsthand knowledge or sense of the effect on of receiving the letter on individuals? Did it have an effect?
So for what it's worth, I'm sure that this was discussed. I meant to mention, I'm sure that this has been, I had no doubt that this was discussed by Secretary Dunlap earlier and the ACLU representative as well, but I don't know of any student, because of the timing of the sending of this letter was sent a week or two ago. It's not like many people are registering to vote at this point. The primary is not till the summer, and then the general election is obviously not till the fall. So I don't think that this particular letter had the effect of maybe scaring the particular individuals who received them, but I think that the surrounding narrative around it definitely might have. Because I think that I know that at least on our campus and around the city as well, people do not have the disposable income available to pay these fines or these potential fines. And that threat of a fine or that threat of the need to pay to re-register your car even, which is a de facto fine at some level, is a barrier to access to at least register to vote. So I don't know if those individuals who had already registered to vote and received the letter are going to unregister to vote or anything like that. I wouldn't necessarily expect that, but I do think that the other individuals who may have potential voters might have been discouraged from acting upon. The other thing that I would point your attention to is last year, before the 2016 election, there was a similar there was similar information distributed before that election to, I don't know if that was actually distributed to the wider community, but it was definitely distributed to many Bates students, which made similar connections between the motor vehicle policy in this state and one's voting rights. And that definitely had a pretty adverse effect on at least on the narrative of whether we could vote or not as students in Lewiston. That letter was not, or that like flyer was not as official looking as this one though. So that was just sort of like something that you would tape on a telephone pole, as opposed to the much more formal letter sent by the mayor recently.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, just a comment. Of course, being a resident of Lewiston and everything, and I circulate amongst other people, and I liked your point of view. It was very refreshing in that some of my colleagues, and you get to talking, the way they reduced that to was Democrat, Republican, it was all political. You're the first person that I had heard that had looked at it in a refreshing way, that this was actually trying to address the other people that weren't necessarily Bates students. They're residents, but perhaps they fell into this category, quite by accident perhaps, that this letter was trying to address, so thank you for that.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
When I go back and talk, I'm going to say we had another opinion.
Any other questions? I have a question. Our record is open until April 21st, 2018. If there's any way that we could get a copy of the mayor's letter as well as the campus articles,
Absolutely.
and the two in the newspaper that you mentioned, we would greatly appreciate it. We have the address here or an email address.
Absolutely, I have the memo, and I will definitely, I wasn't planning on testifying, so, or else I would have had copies for all of you. I apologize for that, but I will definitely submit it for the record.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
All right. Thank you for
you.
staying.
Of course.
The meeting is now adjourned.